Thank you so much to Madeleine for the introduction and for the invitation to present here. It's a real honor to be here, especially among so many people that I consider really mentors and colleagues, even some former students, and it's a real honor to be able to present at CESS. So thank you so much to Madeleine for the invitation. I'm going to read a paper in the hope that this allows me to stick to time a little better. Last summer, while conducting some library research in Moscow, I was woken early one morning in the dormitory apartment of the Kyrgyz acquaintance, Albina, whom I had been visiting. Albina, glued to her phone, was discussing an Amerikanka, an American, with her husband. Albina had been living in Moscow for most of the previous 9 years, where she worked 3 jobs and a 60-hour working week as a gynecologist in private medical clinics. Her husband, meanwhile, was in Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, where he was overseeing the decoration of a new apartment in one of the city's recently constructed so-called elite high-rise buildings. This is one of them, paid for with the couple's earnings in Russia. I wondered who the Amerikanka they were discussing might be. Perhaps another researcher. Perhaps someone whom Albina had found to help teach her English. But this Amerikanka, according to Albina's comments at least, had too much gold and was too lumpy. She was an inanimate thing. As I pulled myself out of bed and peered over to where Albina was glued to her smartphone, I realized that Albina and Kairat weren't discussing a new American acquaintance, but a brand of wallpaper. One of several possibilities for decorating their new apartment. Using Viber, one of several mobile phone apps that has become an integral part of the infrastructure of transnationalism between Kyrgyzstan and Russia, Kairat and Albina were discussing one part of their home decoration. Kairat in Bishkek was at the market, where he photographed and uploaded images of the different wallpapers that he was considering. And to those in the room under the age of 40, Viber is a mobile phone app that allows you to upload pictures and text messages and various other things. This was introduced to me by Albina. I was unaware of this. Albina, in turn, would comment by text message, adding in short, telegraphic spoken comments where necessary. The whole of their new Bishkek apartment, down to plumbing fixtures, floor tiles, paint, kitchen appliances, and so forth, had been discussed this way with photos, instant messaging, and free phone calls. This morning conversation continued in this way for about 40 minutes while Albina was doing other things, while the details of wallpaper and light fittings were determined. Since Kairat had moved to Bishkek several months earlier, Viber had served as a constant rolling backdrop to their respective days. Albina reflected on how the nature of her own connection with home had shifted during the near decade that she had been working in Russia. In the early days, there had been no phone connection with her or Kairat's parents. Staying in touch consisted in a fortnightly conversation with a relative in Osh, who in turn passed messages to their families in Batken district. Now, if Kairat didn't hear from Albina for a few hours, he began to get nervous. Her distance from him didn't make him any less curious as to her whereabouts, or, as she pointed out, any less rivnivy or jealous. Indeed, one of the reasons they used Viber, she confided, was that it had a GPS function. Each could tell exactly where the other was physically located. For 2 decades now, scholars of transnationalism have been reflecting on the density of connections that sustain translocal intimacies in contexts of protracted outmigration. Kairat and Albina's experiences are unexceptional in this regard, their everyday lives involving the habitual and unreflexive movement between languages, here Russian and Kyrgyz, currencies, time zones, administrative regulations, passports, they both held Russian citizenship but also used Kyrgyz passports, and gendered modes of behavior. But if transnationalism implies an affective connection to 2 places simultaneously, for Kairat and Albina, Batken in southern Kyrgyzstan remained home, morally and imaginatively. Indeed, Kairat had commented in one of his extensive conversations with me when I had first met him 4 years earlier. All the same, even with a Russian passport here, we're Chorny, we're black. Moscow, for Kairat at least, never felt entirely like home. And he had other ambitions for the future than staying in town. In the summer of 2015, Kairat's picture was on billboards around Batken town. I haven't included his picture here for confidentiality reasons. As he was running on the party list for one of Kyrgyzstan's smaller political parties. In fact, I ran into him, as you do, in Batken airport, and he said, "Oh, I'm running for parliament." Albina, in a headscarf now and a long skirt, figured on this campaign material alongside Kairat, her demeanour revealing little of the decade of Moscow life that had enabled her husband's electoral campaign to materialise. There are a couple of seats here. I hate seeing people standing at the back. If people need seats, there are some on the front. I begin with this vignette to open a little the question that I want to explore in this keynote concerning the ways that we might reimagine area studies in an age of mass migration and mediated transnationalism. Migration has not unmoored Kairat and Albina from place. Indeed, it's striking the degree to which their earnings have been invested in articulating connections to multiple Kyrgyz places, to the village of Kairat's parents, to Batken town, where they eventually wanted their daughter to attend school, to Bishkek, where the rental income from a newly refurbished apartment would act as a safety net if the ruble crisis continued. But their hopes, their imaginations, their economic strategies, their livelihoods, even their modes of communicating intimacy cannot be separated from the fact that their lives are lived simultaneously in two social fields, 3,000 kilometers apart. A world in which Albina presents herself to her Moscow clientele as Svetlana Kim, as a Russian of Korean heritage, where the minutiae of how to do up their Kyrgyz room, their Kyrgyz uy, in an apartment that is marketed as European can be decided before breakfast, where a husband can check whether his wife has come home on time using the GPS function on her mobile phone. What has area studies to say about this? Or about the millions of lives and livelihoods that would challenge our methodological regionalism? The challenge, I think, for area studies is not just that lives such as these are lived across the boundaries of conventional regional demarcations of the world, though that for sure is still an issue. Scott Levi has eloquently described how he was discouraged from studying Indian traders in Central Asia because the project just didn't fit conventional area studies frameworks. Area studies, after all, has paid plenty of attention to migration from the perspective of sending or receiving communities, a binary nonetheless that still posits singular place as the site of origin or destination. My concern more fundamentally is to do with how area studies has tended to conceive of space itself, and the implications of this for scholarship and for the kinds of questions that we ask. My claim is that area studies has tended to operate with a rather flat and atheoretical account of space, as flat, inert, isomorphic, bounded, as a two-dimensional platform upon which social life is conducted, and that this has implications for the kind of questions that we have asked and for our theoretical ambition, as well as for our ability to speak to scholars outside of our area studies field. I want to ask here what might follow if we adopt an approach to space that treats it, as geographer Doreen Massey has put it, as lively. That is to say, not as a static plane upon which action takes place, but as itself, as she puts it, that sphere of a dynamic simultaneity, constantly disconnected by new arrivals, constantly awaiting to be determined by the construction of new relations. Can we, in other words, imagine area studies without being tied to the category of area in the sense of a two-dimensional Euclidean version of space as surface? And can we do so, for this is the bit that really interests me, while nonetheless retaining a defense of area studies as such, that is to say, while defending the value of a scholarship attentive to context, to history, to language, to complex institutional legacies, to alternative registers of value, and to the specificity of place. I'll put my cards on the table and suggest that we can. Moreover, that such a project is critically important in the face of two strands of social science mainstream. One in its more predictive and quantifying variant that would reduce culture or ethnicity or religious identity to independent variables in a formal model. And the other in those self-proclaimed critical variants, varieties of post-structuralism and globalization theory, that in assuming that the whole planet has fallen under totalizing discursive practices originating from the West, fails to recognize their own Eurocentrism. In other words, area studies, I think, has something to say to versions of social science mainstream that often think of themselves as opposed, both of which nonetheless erase context and specificity. In the second half of my talk, I want to explore some ways that we might reimagine area studies that takes area itself as a critical object of attention and not merely as a framing device. Analogously, say, to how queer theory has playfully reworked the very category of queer, to suggest some alternative spatial and temporal idioms that we might engage in such a process of imagination. But before that, I want to try and tackle head-on the question of area studies' relevance. For it will come as news to few in this audience that the fate of area studies, and Central Eurasian studies in particular, tends to follow the winds of geopolitics. And these winds are not blowing kindly right now, and Laura Adams has done a lot of work to kind of illuminate this. It was not always thus. 12 years ago, in a series of invited articles on the fate of Caucasus and Central Asian studies for the Social Science Research Council, a number of eminent scholars, some of them in this room, wrote with cautious hope that the tide of Central Asia's marginalization might be turning. Stephen Hansen noted in his contribution that, quote, the shock of the events of 9/11 has obviously refocused government and academic attention back to the Caucasus and Central Asia, making their hard-won specialist knowledge of these regions relevant again to the social science mainstream. I remember CESS conferences in the early 2000s when prospective scholars of Afghanistan were courted by government folk in sleek suits with abundant supplies of business cards. Maybe they're still here. Central Asianists, it seemed, were in demand, though less by a social science mainstream perhaps than by government and military agencies engaged in a war on terror. A decade on, though, that moment of optimism about our potential to shape a social science mainstream perhaps looks more like a temporary blip. The subsequent decade, a poignant reminder of the way that opportunities for meaningful international scholarly dialogue can be sacrificed on the altar of securitization. In 2013, the US government's Title VIII research and training funding, which supported a whole raft of language and area studies programs, failed to receive any allocation from the State Department. When the program was reinstated earlier this year, its budget, $1.5 million, was less than half that of 2012. It's not difficult in such a context to find bleak prognoses for the field. Kenneth Yalowitz and Matthew Zhansky wrote in the National Interest last year of the slow death of Russian and Eurasian studies. Sarah Kenzior pitched her keynote to students of the Central Eurasian Studies program in Indiana last year as a eulogy to Central Asian studies. And Stephen Hansen, whom I quoted a moment ago, argued in his 2014 presidential address to ASES, the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, that area studies is dead, and we should instead find a new moniker to describe what it is we do and how we work. Hansen's suggestion, which I'll return to later, is for us to redefine area studies as global and regional studies. Certainly then, there are plenty of reasons to be concerned about the prospects for our field, of which the fortunes of US State Department allocations are only one, not insignificant aspect. Central Eurasia remains on the margins of better established and better resourced area studies programs. Acquiring the languages needed for research can demand time, tenacity, improvisation, and a lot of luck as universities cut back on their language provision. At the same time, as many of us know, the number of jobs in which the search is specifically for a scholar of Central Eurasia in, say, political science, anthropology, history, sociology, can pretty much be counted on the fingers of one hand. I know of one sociologist conducting doctoral research in an Ivy League university who was told outright that Kyrgyzstan doesn't sell and that if she was looking for a job at the end of her doctorate, she would better undertake a comparative study with China. It's often said in response that we shouldn't care, or that marginalization is no bad thing. Intellectual creativity emerges from the edges, we are told. Those places where the grand theories, conventional periodizations, and established orthodoxies don't fit. Well, yes, and there have been some brilliant examples of that when it comes to, say, histories of 20th century collectivization, or the so-called era of stagnation under Brezhnev, which in large parts of Central Asia was anything but. And again, I think of scholars in this room who've contributed to these literatures. But such heterodoxy only works if there is an audience. If a tree falls in the forest of Central Eurasian studies, does it make a sound? More urgently, if scholars of and from the region are arrested, denied visas, deported, or is more and more the case, it seems, denied permission to attend international conferences or co-publish with their Western colleagues, quite how is that intellectual creativity to trump self-censorship? Such issues and the impact they're having on our field have been an object of considerable discussion, and it's at conferences such as this and in the margins, and in the work, say, of the CESS task force on fieldwork safety. But there's another related issue for diagnosing the health of area studies, and it's this that I'm going to focus on, which has to do with the label itself. As Diane Conquerwell put it, area studies has become a dirty word in American, indeed in broader Anglophone academia, and I quote, labelled a relic of the Cold War that serves no epistemological purpose in our globalised world. If the challenges we now face are trans-regional or global, challenges of climate change, environmental degradation, of mass migration, of health and educational inequalities, of religious and secular fundamentalisms in their various guises, of digital militarism and online surveillance, then the question goes, what value is area studies? An approach to the global that would seem by definition to be tied to arbitrary, or worse, geopolitically determinist framings of the world region. Is area studies necessarily destined to be parochial and particularistic? In my own discipline of anthropology, the answer to that question often seems to be an implicit yes. I've often heard graduate students being encouraged to place their more ambitious scholarly articles in the high-hitting disciplinary journals that are likely to land them jobs, while treating area studies publications as a repository for their merely empirical contributions. Indeed, I've sometimes heard it used as a term of distanciation or a way of damning with faint praise. Well, he's more of an area studies person, being used to imply that he or she doesn't really do theory, is somehow unable of moving beyond the specific to the general. Is reimagining area studies then akin to resuscitating a dead dog, unpleasant, sad, and destined to fail? I'm not sure, but I think we need to try, precisely because the need for nuanced, informed voices about the region could not be greater. But if we're to make the case for the value of what we do, we need, I think, to critically interrogate the category of area itself. That is to say, we need to find a way of uncoupling area studies from static, geographically determinist, territorially bounded readings of culture and political process. There are three aspects of the area in area studies that I want to interrogate. First, as a way of thinking space, area is intrinsically two-dimensional. The dictionary definition of area has the extent or measurement of a surface or piece of land. It treats space, in other words, as surface, and therefore isomorphic, as static, as a neutral plane of action. Area here as the stage on which something takes place. Now, while we might not consciously invoke area in this literal sense every time we invoke area studies, I think that there is, implicit in a structuring of the globe into discrete cartographic spaces, a kind of flattening that goes on. It's striking, for instance, how many of the visual representations of the Central Eurasian region take the outline political map of the 5 post-Soviet states, or more if we include the Caucasus, as the visual form for representing where we work. Or how in each of the Central Asian states, the internally undifferentiated political map, usually floating as though dismembered from any regional context, becomes an icon for the state as such, alongside the flag or the coat of arms or the visage of the president. Here's one from the village where I was doing research this summer in Andarak, in fact. Andarak is nicely marked on this map of Kyrgyzstan, population 5,000. Those maps, the maps we operate with, would look really different if, for instance, our default mental map of Central Eurasia was a map, say, of population densities. Here's one of Tajikistan. Or of topography, or of river and canal networks, or of Twitter users. By starting with area, rather than, say, with density of population or air connections, or with volume of mountainous terrain, say, or with time taken to reach 2 points, we operate with an implicit reading of area that privileges certain imaginations of space over others. And, as several scholars have pointed out, a reading of space that would see that place as uniquely dangerous, fragmented, or conflict-generating. Konfliktagilny. I've got another of these population maps, this one of China, and you can see just how the population of density of eastern China differs from that of Xinjiang, and again how this kind of would alter how we think about the spaces of China and of Xinjiang in relation to Central Asia. I mentioned a moment ago that the way that we tend to also portray the region as uniquely dangerous, fragmented, or conflict-generating. Consider, for instance, how the region gets advertised to prospective students in the US. Come to Central Asia to live in a yurt and learn about geopolitics and military positionings. We laugh, but I think these images are not, they have real effects. I want to dwell for a moment with the question of depth and terrain in particular. Other than those professionally trained to look below the ground's surface or into the air, we rarely think about the material, three-dimensional aspects of space. As geographer Stuart Eldon has argued in a recent article, I quote, "We all too often think the spaces of geography as areas, not volumes. Territories are bordered, divided, and demarcated, but not understood in terms of height and depth." In his own work in the West Bank, Eldon has shown how the dynamics of unequal power can only be understood by looking three-dimensionally, at the way that competing sovereignties cross-cut in networks of roads, say, which privilege some and block others, or of underground tunnels. Geopolitics, he argues, following architect A.L. Weizmann, is, quotes, "a discourse which ignores the vertical dimensions of power by looking across rather than to cut through the landscape." This was the cartographic imagination inherited from the military and political spatialities of the modern state, end quote. That's a quote from Weizmann, as quoted in Stuart Eldon. In the Central Eurasian region, one way that we might reimagine area studies three-dimensionally would consist in attending in a more detailed and consistent way with the social and political implications of this varied material configuration. Not just the obvious differences between mountains and lowlands and the kind of material politics that these enable, but also the way that politics is configured by the possibilities, the imaginations, the potentiality of what might lie just below the surface, or in the movement of things, or in the atmosphere, the anticipation of oil or gold or heavy metals, for instance, the prospect of becoming energy self-sufficient through the harnessing of hydraulic power, the anxieties that come from living in a seismic zone, or the forms of mobilization that occur about the invisible harms of air and water pollution. Detailed attention to how such materialities configure the social can help shed new light, for instance, on how we think about the times and spaces of marginality, or the way that nature becomes central to the imagination of pristine nationhood, or the relationship, say, between online and offline violence, or to the mobilizing dynamics of protest. Let me bring in a couple of examples to elaborate what I mean. In his illuminating studies of highland Tibet, anthropologist Martin Saxe has shown how villages often characterized as marginal because of their geographical remoteness from centers of power and their closeness to imperial borders, have in fact often played crucial roles as sites of trade and exchange. What this requires is a shift of focus from the border as barrier to the terrain that enables certain high mountain villages to prosper as passing points. Focusing on pathways instead of borders, Saxe argues, and I'm quoting here, amounts to a rotation of gaze by 90 degrees. This rotation, rather than inversion of perspective, brings into view new questions: the relationship between a pathway and its hinterland, and the interdependence and competition between pathways along a borderline. Saxe draws our attention to the importance of terrain for thinking about marginality, a category remarkably missing, I think, in many considerations of borders focused upon the borderland as site of social mixing. In a very different context, that of environmental protest in Kyrgyzstan, Amanda Wooden has demonstrated the importance of attending to the material properties of terrain for thinking about the potentialities and politics of prospective environmental disaster. And here is a map that I saw Amanda using in a recent presentation, which I'm using with her permission, which shows the extent of glacial retreat around the Kumtor mining zone in Kyrgyzstan. So Amanda has demonstrated the importance of attending to the material properties of terrain for thinking about the potentialities and politics of prospective environmental disaster. The fact, for instance, that Kumtor is an open-pit gold mine built upon a glacier, the only one in the world to date, a glacier that is shrinking at alarming speed, accelerated by the deposit of tailings from the mining operations. Wooden's research is relevant for our reimagining of area studies in a second respect too, for it not only challenges us to bring the material and the social into the same analytic frame, attentive to the movement of rocks and glaciers, and ideas and images and laws and finance as much as those of people. It also requires us to question the boundedness of our area studies framings, our methodological regionalism, and the tendency to think the local and the international as at opposite ends of a scale of analysis, small to big, specific to general. Wooden's research shows how we cannot understand the Kumtor mining operation itself, the protests that surround it, and the implications for mining operations elsewhere, including other prospective glacial mining exploits in Greenland, without bringing multiple other internationals into our frame of analysis from the start. Area, in other words, can never be reduced to bounded space. The spaces of local politics are always already mediated by life beyond. But there's a further twist here which has to do with specificity and context. Understanding the meanings of marginality for yak herders and traders in highland Tibet, or the way that a melting glacier in rural Kyrgyzstan inserts into local cosmologies of space and time, or indeed the meanings of nationhood or democracy or protest itself, as say the meanings of opposition to an Uzbek opposition in exile, as Sarah Kendzior has shown, also depend on having the kind of long-term engagement in a region, the kind of language training, the kind of deep sensitivity to context that comes from having an area studies training. Wooden's research, for instance, has shown how the dynamics of local protest in Kyrgyzstan is inflected by enduring understandings of glaciers as sustaining social life, as having a spiritual as well as a material or economic value, just as they are by knowledge of global environmental protest movements and the power of social media. In my understanding then, to pose the question in terms of a training that is either immersive and locally focused or international and comparative in scope is to pose the wrong question. We need a kind of area studies that resists the kind of reductive scalar thinking in which the international is seen as standing over and above the local. Or put differently, we need a perspective that recognizes the connections that link a multiplicity of locals, whether that is the headquarters of the World Bank or a Kyrgyz mining village. Moreover, we need to remind those folks who work on North America or Western Europe and who feel no need to justify the specificity of their research sites that they also do research that is local. In that sense, they also do area studies. It's just that their local tends not to be recognized as such. So area studies can be critiqued for treating space as two-dimensional, as area rather than volume, for fostering methodological regionalism, and for operating with a scalar view of the world in which the local is seen as being below the national or the regional or the international. There's a more profound kind of critique, though, that I think can be levelled at area studies, which is the tendency to treat stasis as prior to movement, analytically and empirically, or what Lisa Malky refers to as a sedentarist metaphysic. Let me try to explain what I mean. If we carve the world into geographically finite areas and treat this as our point of orientation, we are starting from an ontology of stasis. We might then ask who or what is on the move. But being in place is our point of conceptual orientation. This kind of perspective is implicit in much of our language around migration. We talk of sending and receiving communities, of those on the move and those left behind, of departure and return. If we start with a perspective, however, in which we recognize people and things, including rocks and glaciers like this, and tectonic plates, are always on the move, just at different paces and in different orientations, some extremely slow and barely discernible, some extremely rapid, some oriented towards repetition, others towards innovation. Then our optic subtly shifts. Doreen Massey talks about these movements as heterogeneous trajectories. Place, in such a reading, is nothing more than the provisional stabilization of such trajectories, a coming together, as she puts it, of stories so far. And I'm quoting here, "The vast differences in the temporalities of these heterogeneous trajectories which come together in place are crucial in the dynamics and appreciation of places. But in the end, there is no ground in the sense of a stable position. If we can't go back home, in the sense that it will have moved on from where we left it, then no more and in the same sense can we, on a weekend in the country, go back to nature. It too is moving on." Lest this perspective sound overly abstract or counterintuitive, then it's worth for a moment pausing with the way that movement is integral to social life. We might consider how, for instance, an absolute majority of families in some parts of Central Asia are materially tied to the possibility of one or more family working seasonally in Russia. The way that the memory of past movements, forced and voluntary, is integral to national imagination in parts of the region. Or the way that ideas of authenticity, cultural, spiritual, aesthetic, are themselves shaped by the movement of images, movies, fashions, religious texts, missionaries, academic literature, and so on. But movement is also there in the more mundane practices that sustain life and kinship, in the movement of women in marriage, of children to school and city, of water between fields for irrigation, of new families moving out to new land plots, of crops to market, of oil through transnational pipelines, and so on. Our very capacity to conceive of a stable point that is in place, having a home, having a point of return, having the predictability of things staying the same, that water will flow when I turn on a tap, electricity will come on when I press a switch, is enabled by the possibility and fact of movement, as well, of course, by a complex infrastructural assemblage of pipes and wires and regulatory systems. This is significant, I think, because a sedentarist metaphysic abounds, whether in attempts by parliamentarians to limit the international mobility of unmarried women in Kyrgyzstan, in nationalist rhetorics that would assume that one ethnic group has a more authentic attachment to place than another, or closer to my own home, in alarmist public discourses around floods of migrants on the move. I think it has implications more specifically for area studies and for the ways that we might pose our questions. Let me again try to illustrate with two examples. Anthropologist Magnus Marsden has spent the last few years following Afghan traders as they move between commodity markets in China and retail centres in Moscow, Kiev, Odessa, Dubai, and a variety of sites in post-Soviet Central Asia. Many of these men, and it is mostly men, have lived for many years as refugees in Pakistan. Although we might speak of these men as from Afghanistan, their linguistic fluency, their trade networks, their habitus, their ability to move on when things don't work out in one place, need to be situated both within historical legacies of transnational, transregional trading networks and in more immediate histories of war and displacement. Moreover, attentiveness to such networks allows us to reconfigure sites of seeming marginality, and Afghanistan is often treated as multiply marginal in area studies frameworks, not quite South Asia, not quite Central Asia, and not quite the Middle East. It allows us to see these as in fact nodes of connectivity constituted by communities of circulation. As Marsden puts it, quote, work on such trans-regional circulations has shown that scholarship that treats regions as fixed geographical categories tends to reduce the status of intermediary locales, such as Afghanistan, to that of marginal borderlands. As a result, there has been insufficient recognition of the ways in which such trans-regional contexts and their inhabitants have acted both historically and in the present as corridors of connectivity that forge links between apparently disconnected spaces. Moreover, following such movements close up, again drawing on long-term local language fieldwork, enables us to unsettle our conventional understandings of scale, of connectivity, of which places we imagine as being local to which others. My second example comes from the work of Emil Nasriddinov and his team of anthropology undergraduates at the American University Central Asia. Emil and his colleagues conducted research among migrant workers from Kyrgyzstan in Kazan and St. Petersburg. Among other things, they were interested in understanding migrants' own lived geographies and how these differed between the two cities. Highlighted here in yellow is one of these maps, that they accumulated several of them, in which the market kind of figures, and it's this recurrent figure of kind of orientation in mental maps when people were asked, in this case, for instance, to draw a map of Kazan or a map of St. Petersburg. What emerged from their remarkable research is both the centrality of the market to lives and imaginaries of migrant traders in the city, and the way that migrants' habitual geographies intersected or not with those of local residents, feeding in Kazan and St. Petersburg to contrasting perceptions of risk among non-migrant populations in both cities. This, I think, is a vivid empirical illustration of Doreen Massey's call to think of space as lively, not as an intrinsic given, not as a stage for social action, but as the fragile provisional outcome of stories so far. Those stories are always diverse and multiple. The story that this map tells is different from the story of the tourist map, just as the political map of Central Asia does different work from a map of trader trajectories. The politically urgent question, of course, is which of these perspectives is privileged in our own scholarship. So where does all of this leave area studies? If, as I have suggested, area studies tends to rest upon a reductive and flattening account of space, one that treats space as surface, the international above the local, and stasis as prior to movement, should we abandon it altogether? Should we, as Stephen Hansen argues, find a less Cold War-ish term, not to mention one that perhaps has more traction among prospective students attentive to what will land them a job? Maybe, but shifting name without interrogating how we think about space and scale and the ways that we might adequately do justice to lives lived between doesn't necessarily solve the problem. In particular, the suggestion that we replace area studies with global and regional studies, to me, risks throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or perhaps not even getting rid of the bathwater itself. For it still implies that there is a regional and then there is the global, two scales, one little, one big, the former impacting upon the latter. Whereas what I've been trying to argue is for an optic attentive to the way that every local, those that mark Central Asian landscapes as much as the corridors of the World Bank, is always already global too, just as the seeming sites of global power are also local, also specific, also constituted by particular historical, geopolitical, and economic configurations. In this sense, even the celebrated non-spaces of airports, shopping malls, and so on, are saturated with particular configurations of economic and political power. We perhaps don't notice them as such because most of these so-called non-spaces are spaces of capitalist consumption par excellence. What we need, I think, is not so much a rejection of area studies, but a repurposing of area, starting with a critical interrogation of the spatial metaphors that organize our field, and perhaps some playful experimentation with some more lively readings of space. We need to do for area what queer studies has done for queer, by illuminating heteronormativity, or whiteness studies has done to expose white privilege by calling out its centrality and exposing its invisibility. We need to illuminate how the production of space is itself linked to the articulation of power, or how our spatial metaphors, think of Silk Roads, pivots, great games, giant chessboards, imperial backyards, nearer broads, and so on, are implicated in these uneven structurings. In my final few minutes, I want to suggest 3 examples, and these are 3 among many possible, of approaches through which such an interrogation of area might occur. These are not intended to be exhausted, and are approaches that emerge from the specificity of my own empirical research on the remaking of borders in the Fergana Valley and transnational labour migration between Central Asia and Russia. There are other such metaphors. The attention to offshoring, for instance, with which Heather Shaw and Cooley have prompted us to think about the spaces of Central Asian power, or the category of territorial imaginary through which Natalie Koch has explored the remaking of urban space in Kazakhstan. First, I suggest we need an attentiveness to traces. Trace is both a spatial metaphor and a temporal one. It alludes on the one hand to movement through a landscape, we trace the path, and at the same time it references the way that the past continues to inhabit, inflect, or haunt the present. Traces attest to something never quite erased, but not entirely present either. We might think of the traces of past modernist or imperial projects that can be found in Central Eurasian landscapes, the junkyards of futures past, as de Genova calls them. Or we might think of the traces of past histories of trade, past practices of honouring the dead, past ways of sacralising landscape that are present, for instance, in the names given to food, in the material forms of burial grounds, or in the names given to villages and sacred sites. In a very different context, anthropologist Michael Taussig has studied the colonial history of indigo, the colour used to make jeans blue. The history of indigo, he shows, is inseparable from a history of colonial trade, the traces of which are present in the very words that we use in English. So what does this approach allow? Firstly, it is a focus attentive to the way that the present is never entirely, the present never entirely erases the past, what Alice Street has called the unplanned historicity of place. Rather than treating space and sovereignty as bounded and tied to the state, a focus on traces allows us to think about overlapping geographies and hybrid sovereignties, and about the land less as surface than as palimpsest. Second, it allows us to see how these past projects, past ways of conceiving place, interrupt at attempts at remaking space. And I think a good example of this at the moment are protests going on in Tajikistan against the remaking of the centre of Dushanbe. Let me try to illustrate with a concrete example, this time from my own research. Contemporary border disputes in the Espera Valley between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan hang in large part on disputes about the recent past, specifically about the authority that is to be granted to past parity commissions, the maps they produced, and the decrees that ratified the decisions of such committees in one Soviet Union republic, but not the other. Currently, disputes over delimitation and demarcation in the Espera Valley, and the areas here in yellow indicate the places where Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan disagree over the boundaries of nation states, currently disputes over delimitation and demarcation hinge precisely on the authority to be accorded to different past moments. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan refer to different maps and different normative acts as authoritative. Yet what is striking when you dig into the history of contemporary border tensions is the way that the present here is haunted by the past, materially and ideationally. This is reflected, for instance, in the way that local understandings of border are inflected by the memory of past land exchanges during the post-war era that are recalled as unfair or corrupt. It's reflected too in the curious repetition that is found in the wording of parity commissions in the post-war period, right up until the 1980s, emphasising the need to overcome past mistakes and the danger of conflict if such disputes are not resolved. In short, we need to attend to the way that geography itself has a history, that border and delimitation here are haunted by a multiplicity of attempts at reordering space, and by the memory that borders here haven't tended to stay stable for long. We can't understand the passion and anxiety that attaches to new borderland construction in this region, for instance, or road and other infrastructure projects, without taking this history into account. A second idiom that I think we can productively explore to reimagine space is that of trajectory. If area focuses our attention on space as bounded, trajectory precisely alludes to the stories so far of which Massey writes. Trajectories direct our attention to movement and to limits upon movement. In the Central Eurasian region, there is, I think, some fantastic work looking at the trajectories and itineraries of migrant workers, commodity traders, international development workers, religious missionaries, students, craftsmen, pilgrims, and others. There is also some great work in progress looking, for instance, at the movement of religious and other knowledge, of sacred sites, sacred objects, of forms of certification, of new building styles, of laws, including some of the more draconian laws against religious freedom or so-called gay propaganda, and of religious apparel. This work, I think, has the potential to interrogate our area studies framings of the world from below by pointing to the forms of connectivity between East, Central, and West Asia in particular that cannot be contained within a traditional area studies frame. This is also the kind of literature that has the potential to unsettle some of the categories that have been developed within the context of that area studies literature, by exploring, for instance, new modes of Muslim sociality that emerge in transnational trading contexts, new forms of hostility and hospitality that accompany, say, the growing presence of Chinese traders or construction workers in the cities of Central Asia, emergent modes of consumption grounded in aesthetics of Islamic piety coming from Turkey and the Middle East, or new forms of online organising that cross national and regional boundaries. It also draws attention to the effortful work entailed in stabilising space, making borders stick. Finally, I think we need a more variegated and temporally differentiated account of the state and sovereignty. That is, we need a more differentiated account of how and why certain ways of making or transforming space come to dominate and exclude others, how and when we become aware of whose rules rule, and how we might account empirically and theoretically for spaces where the state is experienced as absent or failing or non-sovereign. Rather than a geography structured by spatial contiguity and isomorphism, the border, the line demarcating the limits of state sovereignty, we need, I think, a spatial imaginary attentive to points of emergence and intensity, to points of conflict and contestation, or what I have called in the title, pressure points. In her study of botulism in Georgia, for instance, geographer Elizabeth Dunn has shown how understanding the presence of this fatal condition is inseparable from an account of the state in retreat. Botulism, she argues, and I quote, indexes places where the state has failed and where the disciplinary practices of neoliberalism seem unable to take hold. The Georgian state allows a way of interrogating the twin claims that states are both mythic and omnipresent. Again, what this requires is slow, steady, grounded, empirical work to unpack those sites of intensification or differentiation of competing sovereignty claims or of state failure. Why border crossings occur here, why protests occur there, why this place has become central to national imaginaries, why this hospital gets bombed, and so on. The political stakes of such a varied account of space and sovereignty are not insignificant. This work is already occurring. Indeed, the examples that I have referenced here from geographers, anthropologists, political scientists and others show that there is plenty of critical and thoughtful interrogation of ethno-territorial essentialisms in our field. What is striking to me, though, is that most of these critiques have occurred not on the pages of area studies journals, but in disciplinary publications. The conversations are not yet occurring across and between disciplines. More importantly, I think, they haven't yet produced the kind of reclaiming or repurposing of area studies that I think is needed if we are to be able to demonstrate our relevance to a social science mainstream that would cast area studies as defunct or merely parochial. In the past, we have tended to stress the importance of Central Eurasia studies by referring to some intrinsic importance of the region. Look, we really are central. Or worse, to highlight the importance of this region to strategic or military concerns. Look, you need our expertise for your war on terror. To me, these approaches risk reproducing a binary in which area studies can only stake the grounds of its significance on considerations of localism and particularity. As such, we stay trapped in the wings of geopolitical forces, such that our scholarly fortunes are hinged to whether the US State Department thinks our region is strategic or not. I think we need something more ambitious, a reclaiming of area that would illuminate the provincialisms that structure so much scholarship, including that of the social science mainstream. On this, though, I am cautiously hopeful, for our field is still small enough, experimental enough, and I think collegiate enough for us to have these kinds of conversation and to articulate a defence of area studies adequate to the challenges, conceptual, empirical and political, of our time. Thank you.